So on Crow 777 Radio, I think everybody knows that we do a lot of talk about social engineering and the manipulation of our society. Now, first person I'm going to talk about is this happy-looking fellow right here. Does anybody recognize him? That is Edward L Bernays. We've done a full show on him and mentioned him a whole bunch of times. Doesn't he look like a happy guy? Completely manipulated Western society. He better be happy. He knows what he's doing. And while I'm not blaming the entire worldview and space travel and all that on him, I wanted to start with a quote from his 1928 book called Propaganda to show just how easy it is to manipulate people. Because most folks think like, these things could never happen, people would figure it out, blah, 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 but no, you know what? Eggs and bacon. He did it. There's serious Bernays. That's probably more the real him. So, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members in the inner cabinet. They govern us by their qualities of natural leadership, their ability to supply needed ideas, and by their key position in the social structure. Whatever attitude one chooses to take toward this condition, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons, a trifling fraction of our 120 million, remember this is in the 20s, who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. And again, directly quoted from Mr. Bernays from his book Propaganda, written in 1928. Now, who the hell doesn't think that sounds like stuff that's going on today? That was almost 100 years ago. Crazy, right? All right, so let's go way back in time. If you're a follower of the show, you know we talk about history a lot and don't know exactly when things might actually be, but this would be quite a long time ago. There are quite a few ancient writings that could fall into the notion of science fiction long before the genre itself was ever created and dubbed. One of the earliest examples would be the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh, which is actually considered the first known work of recorded literature, the earliest versions of which are said to be from around 2000 BC, mainstream history, of course. Another great example from the olden times would be the ancient Indian poetry of the Hindu epic Ramayana, which included notions of flying machines that could travel in the air, in space, and also underwater. And some might suggest that these capabilities are more similar than different. These are supposed to have had advanced weaponry that was capable of destroying entire cities. And two final examples for the way back when, although there's plenty of others, are several works by the ancient Greek playwright Aristophanes, as well as the Christian Bible. And there's lots in that can be looked at from multiple angles. I think most people could agree, no matter what your actual spiritual beliefs might be. Coming along through the centuries, we get to this interesting fellow. Thomas More's 1516 fictional story of Utopia is an interesting narrative that was almost certainly looked upon for inspiration by later authors. It describes a fictional island whose population were able to perfect every perceived aspect of society. This is why the name Utopia has become a descriptor for a perfect society in modern language. The astronomer Johannes Kepler also contributed to early sci-fi with his fictional work of stories of the moon called Somnium. It was written in 1608, but not actually published until 1634 by his son Ludwig. Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov have referred to it as the first work of science fiction. So we definitely covered a whole bunch of centuries right there, but you can see that even however long ago this actually was, people were thinking about these concepts of what else is out there. The early 19th century saw some major leaps towards the concept of modern science fiction with the works of Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley, by the way, a lot of people don't know, hung around with a lot of elite circles, so go figure. Her most famous work, which of course everyone knows is Frankenstein, was published in 1818, and it has the mad scientist concept at its center, along with some very transhumanist notions with the creation of life from death through the use of new advanced technology. She also wrote a short story in 1826 called Roger Dodsworth, the Reanimated Englishman, which has a man frozen in ice from a previous century and revived in the current time frame. These are early notions of cryonics, by the way, something that a lot of people definitely weren't thinking about in the 19th century. Another short story also has some transhumanist notions. Her 1833 piece, The Mortal Immortal. It tells of a man who drinks an elixir belonging to his alchemist mentor. Gotta love how alchemy pops up through these things. And his name was Cornelius Agrippa. Even though immortality seems a wonderful idea of eternal tranquility, it becomes apparent to him that he is cursed to endure an eternity of psychological torture as everything and everyone he loves dies around him as he goes on. Of course, if you ask any of the people nowadays, they're just gonna upload themselves in the computers and they don't care, right? In the late 1800s, we see full-blown science fiction notions being released, with the works of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells being the two biggest names. So here we have Jules Verne. While he wrote a lot of things in his lifetime, the book From the Earth to the Moon has some very interesting aspects to it. The first thing is that he chose the United States as the first country to go after a moon launch. While he used a giant cannon, which was, interestingly enough, called the Columbiad space gun. And if you don't know that name, word, Columbia, big deal, used over and over and over again. The Apollo 11 command module was named Columbia. And instead of a rocket to send people to the moon, there was still a vast number of things that are almost right on the bullseye in comparison to what the official narrative of the Apollo missions would eventually be. The stories are constructed along the same lines, with strikingly similar weights. Aluminum was used in the constructions of both. The size and shape of Jules Verne's vehicle would closely resemble the Apollo Command Service Module. Verne's launch place is in Florida, rather close to where the actual mission is supposed to have been launched from, about 140 miles from Cape Canaveral. Both crews were composed of 3 people. The stated costs after inflation is considered were also very close. I love this, this is so funny. The journey to the moon is supposed to take about 4 days in both stories. Verne is supposed to have had calculations done for all the aspects required, and this is supposedly to be why he got so close to the reality of what the speed was needed to launch Apollo 8. He anticipated the concept of weightlessness in space. Verne's capsule even splashes down in the Pacific in the sequel novel and was rescued by a naval vessel just in real life, which happened to be called the USS Susquehanna. Coincidences, I'm sure. Next, we have this very interesting fellow that we've discussed many times on Crow 777 Radio. He's got lots of connection to the elitist infrastructure, and we brought this up multiple times because he was very influential for many decades. H.G. Wells wrote of many things that would later become a reality, a lot of which could have contained information that he gained from the circles he frequented. In his 1901 novel, The First Men in the Moon, a material that produced anti-gravity effects are used. I just lost my place. Are used for a space capsule. The telling thing, however, is when one of the 2 main characters, named Mr. Bedford, who was a London businessman in the novel, makes the comment regarding the material that was called cavorite, that its commercial production could be a possible source of wealth enough to work any sort of social revolution we fancied. We might own and order the whole world. This was a big, big thing with H.G. Wells. The majority of the book is actually kind of a bit silly, full of very fanciful early science fiction concepts such as bug-eyed aliens, but Wells absolutely cannot help but lace his social engineering notions throughout the entire narrative. And he was very influential, as I'm sure most of you know. All right, moving along. The term spaceship, being used in the sense of a manned spacecraft, is normally attributed to J.J. Astor's 1894 novel, A Journey in Other Worlds, which is a futuristic story set in the far-off year of 2000. However, spaceship also appears in an 1880 Pall Mall Gazette article in reference to the works of Jules Verne. So let's take a moment to talk about this interesting chap because he was also connected. John Jacob Astor, who lived from 1864 until 1912. He was a U.S. businessman, an inventor and author, and great-grandson of the celebrated fur trader. He was one of 4 authors of science fiction, with the others being Jacques Frutal, F.D. Millet, and W.T. Stead, who are known to have gone down in the Titanic disaster. His A Journey in Other Worlds, A Romance of the Future from 1894, features an anti-gravity device called Apergy, which was borrowed from Percy Gregg's Across the Zodiac from 1880. That powers a craft in a tour of the solar system in 2000. Earth itself is a utopia that is dominated by a capitalistic America, and the countries of Europe have succumbed to socialism. One of the protagonists of the tale runs the Terrestrial Axis Straightening Company, whose goal is to rectify Earth's axis. Jupiter is a kind of prehistoric Eden with primitive life forms galore and mineral resources free to exploit. The planet Saturn is a kind of heaven and generates much mystical speculation. That sounds familiar, right? The journey ultimately having as much to do with theological allegory as with scientific prophecy or the theory of parallel evolution. And this is him right around the time of the Titanic. In 1912, we have the introduction of the John Carter of Mars series of stories, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, setting the mindset for a planet Mars that one could live on and one that is, in fact, teeming with life. And plenty of science fiction gets written from this point on, with the concepts of rockets taking over as a means to get to space, as opposed to projectiles being fired out of a cannon. Space opera stories in pulp magazines, along with plenty of other published works, become rather common. 2 such well-known pieces are Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, as well as Flash Gordon. The many works featuring the character of Buck Rogers from the early 20th century are credited with bringing into pop culture and mainstream view the notion of space exploration. Flash Gordon continued to reinforce these ideas. And an interesting point about the character of Flash Gordon was that he is described as a handsome polo player from Yale University. Does everybody know the reference to Yale University with Skull and Bones? Do you see how they do these kinds of funny little things? Yeah, it's there. In 1942, we have the successful use of the German V-2 rocket. This weapon is supposed to have been the first thing that is actually making it into what's called space. Anybody recognize this cat? He's done a lot of fun stuff. 1945, Arthur C. Clarke makes the prediction for geostationary artificial satellites to be used for communications in Wireless World magazine. We've mentioned this in the show a bunch. So basically, in 1945, he said satellites are going to exist. It's going to be a thing. And not too long in the future, it supposedly did. Moving up to the 1950s, we see a massive amount of science fiction material being released, particularly in the form of movies, mostly B films. This is the era of the flying saucer films. A couple good examples. The Day the Earth Stood Still with Gort. I actually really like that one. My mom introduced me to that when I was a kid. A great one with killer effects for the time, no less. 1958, Forbidden Planet. It's a funny story about that is every time we mention it, Crow always forgets the name, and I always have to say Forbidden Planet. He's like, that's it, Leslie Nielsen. In what's supposed to be the real world in late 1950s, we have the proclaimed events of the launching of the satellites Sputnik on October 5th, 1957 by the Soviet Union, and Explorer 1 by the United States on January 31st, 1958. All right, the 1960s we're on to. Yuri Gagarin is said to be the first person to fly in space. The flight on April 12th, 1961, is said to have lasted 108 minutes, there's some of your encoding numbers, as he circled the Earth for a little more than one orbit in the Soviet Union's Vostok spacecraft. More missions are said to follow with the Soviet Union, as well as the United States joining the game with Mercury, Gemini, and the oh-so-fun Apollo programs. That's the Gemini logo, and you can see encoding galore here if you want to take a moment to look at those. All right, 1963, one of my old favorites started. Doctor Who, and the original run would run all the way to 1989, and of course, journeys through time and space, space travel, not a problem. It's all easy. Real popular one here in the mid-60s, Lost in Space, which ran from 1965 to 1968. But they all pale in comparison to Star Trek. 1966 to 1969, Star Trek was the wagon train to the stars, with plenty of social engineering to go along with it. And you'll notice that the Starship Enterprise is, in fact, actually a great big flying saucer with just some extra stuff. So they were drawing directly off of the previous generation of stuff to keep moving things along. And this is an important point we bring up all the time. You really learn a lot when you look at things decade by decade. And that's why we did a decade series a couple months back. You can really see how, like, literally things is almost like a lever being switched when you go from the 40s to the 50s to the 60s to the 70s. Everything changes. The color schemes, the clothing, the music, everything. It's like it's being pre-planned. Can't be, though, right? Total coincidence. All right, this one is huge in many ways, shapes, and form. 2001, A Space Odyssey, which, as a kid, when I watched it, I only watched it once because it actually really gave me, like, creepy vibes, besides being kind of boring for, like, a 10-year-old to watch. I felt something even before I knew anything. There was just something about it, and now I know why. It was released in 1968, and this film shows the general public what space travel is supposed to look like and how it will be depicted by the world's space agencies. There's a scene towards the beginning, just to give an example of the slow weightlessness as they're on the Pan Am shuttle going from the Earth to the moon. Great example of how they're programming everybody. This is what space is going to look like, by the way. The storyline for this epic feature film was a cooperative venture between Arthur C. Clarke, Mr. Satellites in 1945, and of course, the great Stanley Kubrick. And of course, a bunch of NASA people. Very famous picture gets floated around, but that's a whole bunch of NASA guys over in England. They're all palling around together. Why they're hanging out with the director, I don't know. You tell me. There's so much that can be said about 2001: Space Odyssey, but if you want a very interesting breakdown just on the film itself, I highly recommend the first episode of Bill Cooper's Mystery Babylon series. I've listened to it multiple times. There's about 43 episodes. You want a master's degree on the Mystery Babylon religion and the symbolism and all the horrible things that these nasty controllers do, you're going to learn a lot from them. All right. Moving along. Planet of the Apes, 1968. Again, space travel, going out, coming back. That movie was also highly influential for the time. Getting back to the fun of NASA, Skylab, we're done going to the moon, but no, we're going to put people up there in the first big space station, and this ran from 1973 all the way to 1979, and I'm actually old enough to remember them yapping about this and Tang in space and all that crap. Another low budget but very influential show, Space 1999. This one ran from 75 to 77. And again, if you look at Star Trek from the late 60s to a show like this in the late 70s, again is very, very, very apparent the difference in the decades. Star Trek is super colorful and everything's kind of happy and hippie and blah, blah, blah. Here we have the drab, the dark colors, everything's kind of sterile, just complete antithesis to everything that the happy 60s was compared to everything of the grit of the 1970s. It's something that really stands out to me starkly. And then, of course, we have the biggest of the big, Star Wars, 1977. I was 4 years old when I saw this in an old theater that was like a real theater, and I remember leaning on the brass rail when Darth Vader walked out for the first time, just going, wow. And, of course, I was hooked. 4 years old. Things will, of course, never be the same after this. Star Wars is Star Wars. Everybody knows what Star Wars is and the influence it's had. Close Encounters of the Third Kind also came out in 1977. And here we have the little gray guys with the big heads and large black eyes that will never go away after this. Everybody seems to have a little obsession with them and, well, anal probes, right? This is a show I loved as a kid, but again, extremely influential. Buck Rogers in the 25th century makes a return from the early 20th century and ran from 79 to 81. That was always my favorite picture. And of course, the other one that was really cool was Battlestar Galactica that ran from 78 to 79, plus that awful Galactica 1980 thing they did that was just absolutely atrocious. But let's not forget, Star Trek's coming back, guys, and it's never going to go away after this. This is Star Trek the Motion Picture. Of course, we have a major NASA reference with a not real probe, but Voyager 6, it being the heart of the storyline here. And of course, Star Trek continues on to today with its numerous spin-offs and highly influential. Moonraker, we have James Bond in space because Star Wars was so successful. The companies started jumping on this and like, what other space stuff can we make quickly? So Roger Moore got to play around in space shuttles and stuff. And for anybody who's into the whole Mandela effect thing, this is the one I cannot explain with the girl with the braces and all that. And I'm not going to go into a big tangent on that. But Crow poo-pooed Mandela effect to me, and I'd already discovered this. I said, I agree with you except for this. And I tricked him one day. I called him and said, hey, did you ever see Moonraker? He's like, yeah. I was like, do you remember the scene where Jaws falls and the girl picks him up and blah, blah, blah? He's like, yeah. The girl with the braces. I was like, she doesn't have braces. He's like, what? She doesn't have braces. And, well, I got him thinking in different ways. One of the few times I got Crow 777 to really look at something he was not thinking about. First Alien movie, 1979. The late 1970s into the 1980s, we have NASA's Space Shuttle program lasting until 2011. At the dedication of the Space Shuttle Enterprise, on September 17th, 1976, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, and all the original crew of the original Star Trek series, with the exception of William Shatner, are there to do the whole induction ceremony. So again, science fiction and reality dancing together and laughing at you. Anybody recognize this one? Flash. Yes, exactly. What a fun comeback for Flash Gordon that one time, and what a great soundtrack. 1980s, we have, of course, a plethora of space shows. Space is huge in the 80s, of course. Numerous films, books, all of that. We have the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Make of that as you will. I'm sure a lot of you know there might be some real funny business with that. January 28th, 1986. And of course, we have the Star Trek franchise returning to television in the form of Star Trek The Next Generation. That was 1987. And will remain a staple from this point on in numerous mediums. And of course, they just brought it back again about 2 years ago with a real crappy version called Discovery. And currently, Star Trek is being used, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, as part of the social engineering nightmare that's being pushed on our throats with all this. What's up, Gabby? What? Picard. Is that the one? Yep. I did watch the trailer for it. I didn't see anything crappy in it too much. But do you guys know about the whole agenda thing that's in a lot of entertainment, like most entertainment now? All these old intellectual properties that we all grew up loving are being used as part of this. And that's not what I'm on about here today, but you'll see it everywhere. Star Wars has been flushed down the toilet. Doctor Who has been flushed down the toilet. Star Trek definitely. All of them, really. There's really not much that isn't being used to just be completely manipulative at this point. 1995, I'm sure most of you recognize this, Apollo 13, and it's a film that, of course, will reinforce the myth of the Apollo moon missions. I'm sure most of you are opinionated about that as well. 1999, the Star Wars franchise returns for good in the form of Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, excuse me, plus many more to follow. I have no idea where that came from. This franchise, which is now owned by the mega-evil franchise-devouring super corporation called Disney, is currently one of many that are being used for social engineering agendas on many levels for the past several years, and we unfortunately see no sign of that relenting. In fact, the new Terminator movie that just came out was full of this crap, and it bombed. It's lost tens of millions of dollars already, and it's never going to recover because people don't want this crap. Here's the problem. I think we're at a point, and I use a couple things as a litmus test. I keep an eye on several of what I call the geek channels on YouTube, and they're channels that really get into all of this mainstream entertainment things like comic books, television shows, movies, video games, all of that stuff. Now, the big thing that they're noticing, and they're not necessarily conspiracy people or anything like that, is that all this agenda stuff is getting into them, because most of these guys are like at least in their 20s, if not older, and there's girls too. I don't want to sound exclusionary there. And they're getting sick of all this agenda stuff being a huge part of what little storyline is already there, and they're just sick of it, so they're not buying into it. Two great examples, if you want to perform the same litmus test that I use. There's a channel called Nerdrotic and a channel called Geeks and Gamers, and they cover, between those two channels, they'll cover all of the sci-fi and all of that, and if you want to see just how bad things are getting, go look at them ripping these things to shreds. Now, whether they really understand the motivations behind the scenes, I don't know. I'm trying to find ways of reaching out to these people and seeing if maybe one of them wants to do a show with me or something, but it's very noticeable, and more normal type folks, if you want to call them that, are noticing. So, there you go. Moving along, we have Red Planet in the year 2000, and of course, we have astronauts visiting Mars. I'm sure Elon Musk loved this one. In 2005, Doctor Who comes back, and this also is a social engineering nightmare from the get-go, but the past 2 to 3 years, it's been absolutely horrendous, and they're losing money left and right on it, and they just don't care. And again, this is a huge telling of where they're at and how they're trying to drag society along, because things are changing and they're losing money off of all these properties and they just don't care. That's scary to me, because if companies are no longer having to answer to shareholders and things like that because they're making garbage films, garbage television, they're not selling, yet they're still making them, and these things cost millions of dollars to make, we're at some kind of point here where something might be shifting and going somewhere else that might not be very good. So I don't know what exactly that is, but I'm pointing it out to as many people as I can, because seriously, something's not cool there. 2013, we have the movie Gravity, and this movie shows how to fake space right. NASA could really learn how to use green screen and blue screens correct, in my humble opinion, because this movie looks amazing. I kind of look at it as the 2001 A Space Odyssey for modern times, as far as demonstrating how things are supposed to look and move in space. And there's no lines, there's no jagged video, all that stuff that people love to point out, especially with the ISS, which I don't know what's really going on there, but something is fishy. 2014, we have Interstellar, which also has a whole bunch of this nonsense climate change crap, which is yet another one of those agendas being shoved down our throats that's just nonsense. Yeah, and chemtrails and everything, and I could go off on a tangent on that for an hour. They're using, as I said, they're using all of these major intellectual properties as a means of convincing you that this is the way shit really is, and it's just not true. 2015, The Martian, also has a really cool soundtrack, by the way. 2015, we have the New Horizons probe taking pictures of Pluto. Crow, if you've never seen it, did a fantastic piece on this right after that came out on his regular YouTube channel. So if you want to see him absolutely shred the nonsense about these, that is like 85% accurate to the artist's depiction of what Pluto would look like. Now let's be blunt here. How in the hell could anybody make an artist's depiction of something that up until this point supposedly was nothing more than a blurry blob? Bullshit. That's all I got to say about that. Here's a show I actually kind of liked. It's called The Expanse. It started in 2015 and is still continuing to today. Lots and lots of space travel, however, and again, you see lots of how space is supposed to be. But I've noticed something very interesting that's happened in the past few years, and you can tell me if you've noticed this as well. The idea of what happens when a human being is thrown out into open space seems to have been changed recently. I'm talking about without a spacesuit, just like chuck someone out an airlock kind of thing. Don't you remember in the past people would either like explode or freeze or do something like that? Well, nowadays all of a sudden they're like slowly like getting little particles all over them, and every movie is replicating this in the past couple of years. So they've shifted the narrative on what space exposure does to you. I don't know why. This is one of the ones that I've mentioned on the show. I don't know why they're doing it, but it's just something that definitely caught my attention. And to be honest with you, what happens to a person exposed to a nearly total vacuum was accidentally discovered in 1966 by a NASA engineer named Jim LeBlanc. And the videos are out there on YouTube. You can watch it. His cord comes loose or something like that, and he starts to decompress. And it shows exactly what happens in a vacuum, and it does not match up to what Hollywood says. And then what do we have today? The ISS and all their fun chicanery. NASA's Artemis program, if anyone is not aware, this is the symbol for the new moon missions. Apollo and Artemis in Greek mythology, and if you're familiar with the show, you know we did a whole bunch recently on the myths and why they are super important. So Artemis is the sister of Apollo, Apollo of course being the other bullshit moon missions. Oops, that's heavy metal. That's not Elon Musk, is it? There we go. Wait, similarities? I don't freaking know. I don't know. By the way, another cool soundtrack. I'm a musician, so I appreciate that stuff. But anyway, that's not coincidence at all. SpaceX, his very funny car in space. Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos making stupid money off of Amazon, can make rocket ships. Must be nice. Virgin Galactic, who in, how many years is he on? 15, 16 years now? Not being able to do a damn thing. Because remember, everybody, space is hard, but worth it. We will persevere and move forward together. Yeah. Okay, Richard Branson. And that's it, folks. I tried to keep it short but sweet because I know we don't have a lot of time. If anybody wants to talk about anything, I don't even know what time I've got, but if anyone has any questions or anything I presented here or just questions about Crow and myself in general, feel free to hit me up before I walk off the stage. Thank you. And this is the first time I've ever given a live presentation, so I have no idea if I did a good job or not. What's up, man? Thank you. Yep. Mm-hmm. What number? She knows them all. She's got them in her head. She's like a, computer there. 171. Episode 171. We were talking about the myths. Yeah. Yeah, that was an epiphany that Crow had, and he called me out of the blue. Like, we need to talk about something. I always kind of have this funny feeling when he says things like that. It reminds me of the old corporate days, like, oh, am I in trouble? I'm in the boss's office with the door closed. Close the drama door. We need to talk about your behavior. But now he's like, I had this epiphany about CNN and Jessica going in the well. Do you remember that? And I was like, yeah, I remember that. And he tied it back to the whole myths about truth going into the well and what comes back out. And that's what it is. And that single incident was what made CNN, it pretty much put them on the map. And, well, they haven't stopped with their nonsense, have they? Yeah, didn't they? So what happened after that? Now they can convince you of anything because baby Jessica went into the well. And she lost a toe. Veritas. Veritas has the fake truth has no feet. See, it's all there, all these symbols. This is why we spent 4 or 5 episodes, I don't remember exactly how many, trying to drive home the importance of the myths, the Greeks, the Romans, all this stuff, because whomever the bad guys really are, that's really important stuff to them. All that symbolism, all those stories, they mean something. Doesn't mean that they were true gods and goddesses and all that kind of nonsense. It's all symbolic aspects of nature because, as we always say, there is no lie in nature. If you want to know a truth of something, look to nature. Did I answer your question or is there more to it? That's actually, it wasn't anything like majestic. I started a little podcast called Secrets of Saturn on my own. I was trying to find guests. I was reaching out to a bunch of people that I thought were interesting. We had a mutual friend named James Alfred who was also doing a bunch of interesting work. And at the time, he was doing Russian translations of what's called the Hadibov material. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. Crow thought it was really interesting at first and then backed off from it because it started getting way too out there. And he's like, we can't authenticate any of this. They actually tried to figure out if Hadibov was a real person. They couldn't authenticate it, and you know how Crow and I are. If we can't authenticate something, it's like, hey, interesting, but not our bag. So James Alfred was the first one that got back to me. He did an episode with me. He contacted Crow back. I told him I wanted to talk to Crow too, because this is when Crow's really starting to get his name out there. He was going on Grey Carl, what a lot. And he said, hey, Jason's a really cool guy, really intelligent, definitely has a good head on his shoulders. You should talk to him, even though he's just got a channel that just started. Crow contacted me. We did the show. We got along really, like the same kind of chemistry. If you go back on my old channel that's still there and find that episode, it's not as refined as it is now, but you can tell he and I had a good rapport even that first time. And we started becoming friends immediately. Like we would just talk on the phone sometimes for hours at a time. So our chemistry was building from there and our friendship and all that. He was going to start his podcast. And I suggested to him, hey, this lunar wave thing, of course, is like your thing. Why don't we do a round table with a couple of the other folks who caught it, and we'll do a show on my channel with just 3 of you discussing it, and I'll try and keep the ball rolling between you all, discussing what you all had experience-wise between. And that went really well. That impressed Crow. Started his own podcast, did a couple episodes, asked me to come on with him to do a reverse interview. And he said, think about things that people who watch my material would want to know that I haven't covered yet, because it's easier to see those things from an outside perspective. I was like, that's easy, okay. So the next day I sent him a big list of questions. We did that show on his podcast, went great. I don't remember exactly how many I did before I was officially the co-host, but there was a lot of back and forth. I did several episodes. Rose probably knows how many we actually did. And then at one point he literally just said to me, and I remember the day he did it too. I used to work as a manager at Guitar Center, and we were dead as a doornail, standing behind the accessories counter. I say, oh, Crow 777's calling me. What's up? He's like, hey, do you want to just do this thing with me? You know how blunt he is and to the point. I was like, yeah, let's do this. All right. He's like, what topics do you have in mind? And I was like, well, I've always wanted to do a lot on space fraud. And again, if you guys are familiar with it, we did 6 episodes in a row shredding the mainstream space programs. I don't know anybody else who's attacked it the way we did in that series. So that was it. And then a couple years went by. I don't even know, maybe early 2018, I started nagging him to do a film. I was like, you've got all this material. You have said a lot of things, but it's spread out in little segments on YouTube all over the place. So why don't we do a film with all of your stuff, and we'll do interview segments where you can explain things properly, and we'll do like high quality cinematic looks to everything. Like we'll do it absolutely as best as we can afford to do. And he's like, I don't know if I want to do that. Took me about 3 months. Finally, he's like, all right, let's do this. You're right, I should put this on the record. There's so much material here, and it will probably reach a larger audience as well, because on YouTube, a lot of times once you put a video out, if it's 3 years old, most people aren't going to go back to it unless they have a specific reason. I want to absorb everything Crow 777 has put out. But if it's like some of the most amazing clips that he's put out that's been on YouTube, probably nobody will watch now because they just don't know. So the film kind of revitalized a lot of his most amazing stuff, and all of that, nearly everything he shot is in Shoot the Moon. So what happened was, I went up to visit him in Rhode Island for I think it was about 8 days. I took 2 giant hard drives with me that I bought. I ended up coming back with 6 terabytes of footage. Yeah, terabytes. And thank God he had some of it organized into folders and things, so it made it a little easier. But still, I had to go through all this stuff and pare it down to just what we wanted to put in it and make it look not like a YouTube video. This was my goal with Shoot the Moon. My goal from the absolute beginning was I do not want this to look like a damned 2-hour YouTube video. This needs to look like a film. So the cameras I bought, which are Blackmagic Pocket Cinemas, they shoot, the sensor they use, if you shoot in full RAW and just don't turn everything off, it sucks up data like crazy, but it looks very filmy. So it has that very nice kind of deep saturated color look, and when you put it in DaVinci Resolve, which is a professional video program, editing, color grading and all that, which I taught myself, you can really manipulate it all over the place just like Hollywood does. And that's how all these different films have different looks and things, because modern digital cameras are actually really neato. If you shoot in full RAW, you have so much data to work with, you can give a film any look you want. And that's what I went for. Now, my knowledge is very limited. I have an audio background. I'm an audio engineer for like 20-some years. So that part was easy. That's why if you've seen the film, the audio is super crisp and clear, because that was easy for me. Thankfully, video works very similar, like the way it's a timeline and all that, and editing is very similar. I just had to learn what the different switches, knobs, all the crap that's on the software, like what does what, how do you tighten things up, like all this stuff. So he and I went back and forth multiple times. That's too processed, back it off. That's too processed, back it off. And finally we came to an agreement on, I cleaned up the images, definitely doesn't look like YouTube, and I think it's the best look of anything of his material that's out there. Anybody else? Oh, sorry. That is Propaganda by L Bernays, and we've talked about Bernays a lot. And the reason why I wanted to introduce the presentation with him is not that I'm blaming him for everything that happened, but because that guy single-handedly was able to manipulate Western society in a very big way. And I won't give you a whole lecture on what he does. That was his second book. The first one was also on propaganda and public relations is what he called it, because propaganda started having a bad term after the First World War. It sounded like you're trying to manipulate people. Go figure. So yes, but I just started reading it myself, and it's very interesting. What's your second question?
The second question is, we could talk. I'd like to talk more in depth about this after, but I know for the moon
Yes and no. One person makes a claim that he thought something was up, but for the wrong reasons, and that's a guy named Richard C. Hoagland. Are you familiar with him? He was a young journalist working for CBS at the time, and he's said stories multiple times over the years where he picked up a card where they were talking about the different aspects, and he said he noticed, and I'm not into like a lot of the crazy stuff he says, but he's a very interesting fellow. And he even called Crow once, and Crow scared him off. Kind of funny, actually. But yeah, he questions the way things were presented, but not necessarily that the moon landings didn't happen, but that there's other stuff there. So like, there's a conspiracy there, but it's not what he says. Anyway. We did a show on that. Rose, what number is video games? Do you know? It was a while ago. Yeah, it was a ways. But she's done all the transcripts, so she knows our own episodes better than Crow and I do, because once it's done, we move on. Oh, and I did want to mention, I just started writing a follow-up to Edward Bernays where I'm going through everything he did. We did a timeline with Edward Bernays the first time, but I want to go into more detail on just how much he really did and in the order he did it and who he manipulated and all that. I want to get into more depth with that, and Crow's like, yeah, let's do that. Because that's why I opened up with him. What he did, people just don't realize the impact that this one single dude had on our society. That's why we have an independent website and why we charge a subscription, because, and I know a lot of people get offended that we charge money, but to run a website that isn't connected to Google or any of the other majors, you pay out the ass for every little thing. YouTube, if you're familiar with us from a couple years now, YouTube started striking his channel like crazy and then started ripping out at one point they just took his channel down altogether for a couple weeks, and I had to start uploading our ones on my channel. A bunch of people protested. We don't know exactly how we got the channel back. He protested to Scale Lab, which is the advertising thing. I don't even really know how all that works, but he protested through them. Somehow we got the channel back, but Google played a fun little game with Crow. Before his channel was taken out, and of course everybody knows YouTube is owned by Google. Google is Alphabet. They control nearly everything as far as internet technology and a whole bunch of other stuff. Before that happened, if you put into Google and quite a few other search engines, Lunar Wave, Crow 777, you would get millions of hits with those two keywords. However, if you put just Lunar Wave today, you'll get millions of hits. If you add in a second keyword, Crow 777, drops down to somewhere, and it's different every time, but it's usually in the 6 to 9 to 10,000. And we've tested this with people in other countries and things like that, and they did something with the algorithms where if you use the name Crow 777, it's been scrubbed to some degree. We don't know exactly what happened, but apparently there's some tie-in because it happened immediately afterwards. He got the channel back, and all of a sudden Crow 777 stuff started becoming a hell of a lot harder to find. So yeah, Google is not your friend. Yes, sir. For the subscription? I was going to say the security stuff he has to pay for has been getting ridiculous. So we're always like, we just make enough on the subscription because we don't have a ton of subscribers.
Were you here yesterday when Ghostbusters were on the stage next door?
I was here somewhere, but I wasn't in the room.
Put together a small presentation about the go-fast rocket that
Yeah, I watched that. It went dong.
Well, that too, but do you think that's what, I mean, we're talking fluid up there of some sort.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. People have different theories upon if there is indeed a firmament. Is it a solid barrier? Is it some kind of liquid barrier? We don't really know. And quite honestly, those are the kinds of things that need to be done. The more tests.
Talk with Guru about that because I thought of you guys, the lunar wave, the disturbance and something, you know, and the whole 9 yards, but it just, you should talk to him about what you think of that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, I definitely will. Travis? Sorry. What's up, Carrie?
Did you talk a little bit about passengers? That was really a pretty sweet movie.
Passengers?
Yeah, where they fly off into space and they're going to get there 38 years later or something, or 100 years later.
Oh, yeah, and Star-Lord, whatever his name is. I'm sorry, I didn't see that one. I've been watching less and less mainstream stuff as time has gone on, and I saw the preview for it, but my apologies, I didn't actually see that one. Okay, well, if something like jumps out and Crow says, "Have you seen this?" I'll watch something. So sometimes I see modern stuff, but sometimes I don't. What's up, Travis?
I think it was back when we were talking about H.G. Wells, you mentioned the phrase rectify the Earth's axis.
Yeah, that was in the story. I never read that book, but apparently in the storyline, there was an issue with that, and there was a company that was set up to deal with such things. It was part of like the solar system's bigger companies. Kind of like how in The Expanse, if you've ever seen that, there's companies that span the solar system. It was kind of like a primitive version of that, but of course, people didn't have those concepts really that fleshed out or understood very well in whenever that book came out, like the early 20th century. So I never read it, so I can't tell you more than that. But the fact that H.G. Wells, who we know has massive ties to the elite structure, would even do something like that tells me all I need to know. Like they put things in there to go, ha. Anybody else? I don't know how I'm at on time either, so if you need to pull me down, let me know.
There are no dinosaurs, right?
Crow completely feels there's no dinosaurs. I've wondered, we have discovered a whole lot of stuff where, dinosaurs, the way they're portrayed in mainstream, don't seem to be a real thing. Now, whether there's other creatures that existed before and died off, I personally accept that as a real possibility. Crow and I have never had a debate over it. It's like when we went and looked at the main history, we found out so much shenanigans, and what really broke my heart is, well, that's exactly it. All of this research we do, it always ties back to the same elite cocksuckers, I mean, it's the same freaking people doing this stuff over the decades. And you see, they all tie back, the Royals, Tavistock, the Rockefellers, these names that that get bantied around in conspiracy. But it is these people, or at least an extension of them, because they don't get their hands dirty. They have money literally to burn because they just make it up, and they can just do whatever they want. So they nudge society where they want it to go, and then you have more public figures like H.G. Wells, for instance, putting stuff out there. And I absolutely believe that's going on today, because let's take an example. Star Wars. Star Wars today under Disney sucks. There's no storyline. The main character is a complete Mary Sue who could do anything, is more powerful than anyone who has ever existed as a Jedi ever. No storyline, no character development, nothing. But at least it's a woman, because that's what they want to push. But the women act like men. So again, it's this weird crisscrossing of the genders, get men and women fighting with each other. I don't need no man, down with the patriarchy. And I'm not going to say that for years men didn't dominate a lot of things. Of course, that it was a more male-dominated society. But the way they're doing it now is for divide and conquer tactics and mass distraction, and that's just it. And they're just using all of these stories, these intellectual properties, to push that agenda. In my opinion, but that opinion is shared by many, many people. Yes, sir? Yeah, well, we absolutely have. We did, if you're not familiar, a couple weeks ago on October 20th, we did a kind of like a tester conference in New York City with my friend Billy Ray Valentine, who does a show called The Infinite Fringe on TFR and also an independent podcast. He called me back in, I think, April or May and said that Mark Devlin, if you're familiar with him, great researcher and author, he said he was coming over to the United States to do some research, wanted to do some kind of presentation. Do you want to show Shoot the Moon at the same time? I said, absolutely, but why don't we, if we're going to do this and get an actual room, why don't we put on like a one-day conference? I can get Wayne McCroy, and he's like, well, I can get John Brisson. Bing, we had a conference. We sold the tickets out, and immediately had more people wanting to come in, but the room was small. We had to watch out for the fire codes, so that took care of that. And Dave, am I up on time? I am so sorry. All right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I need to shut up. Thank you so much for coming. This was great.